The Sokolov estate didn't just house secrets, it guarded them like a predator. Polished obsidian floors stretched like frozen lakes beneath vaulted ceilings, where CCTV cameras hummed with the focus of a hawk. The statues in the courtyard stood like silent sentinels draped in frost, monuments to a legacy built on Siberian iron and the silence of the dead. Petra Vaughn moved through the corridors like a flicker of shadow. Her black mate's dress was crisp, the white pleated headpiece a stark contrast to the darkness of the gilded cage. Every step was a calculation, her movements absorbed by the heavy silence of a man who ruled through terror. She'd taken the job 3 weeks ago, drowning in debt and looking for a place where a girl with no family could disappear. The placement agency had been blunt. The Sokolovs provide a fortune, but they demand your soul. Never listen, never linger. Never look at the tattoos on the boss's hands unless you want to see the last thing his enemies ever saw. But secrets, Petra was about to discover, didn't care about the rules of a cleaning crew. The head of security, a man with eyes like polished gunmetal, paused in the hallway just feet from her hiding spot, his phone glowing with a code that was never meant for a maid to see. Before we continue this story, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these stories to life. The Sokolov estate did not merely exist on the outskirts of the city. It loomed like a fortress of glass and Siberian iron, a place where the air felt 5 degrees colder the moment one crossed the threshold. Petra Vaughn moved through the grand foyer with the practiced silence of a woman who had learned that in this house, to be seen was to be scrutinized, and to be scrutinized was to be endangered. Her black maid's dress was a second skin, stiff with starch, acting as a camouflage that rendered her part of the furniture. She carried a silver tray of crystalline water and bitter espresso towards the primary study. Every surface she passed, the Excidian floors, the mahogany panels, shone with a mirror-like finish that felt more like a surveillance tool than a decorative choice. The mansion was a machine, and she was a tiny, replaceable gear. The double doors to the study were flanked by 2 men who didn't look like guards. They looked like statues carved from granite. As Petra approached, they didn't speak. They simply stepped aside, their eyes tracking the movement of her hands. Inside, the room was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the low hum of a dozen servers hidden behind the bookshelves. Victor and Sokolov sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of black marble. He didn't look up as she entered. He was hunched over a ledger, his tailored black sleeve rolled back to reveal the intricate, dark ink that climbed his forearm, a tapestry of thorns and Russian Orthodox crosses that spoke of a life spent in the trenches of the underworld. He was a man of sharp angles and disciplined silence. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were like shards of Arctic ice, cutting through the room with a glare that felt like a physical weight on Petra's chest. "The espresso is late," Victor said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated in the floorboards. Petra didn't defend herself. She simply bowed her head, her white pleated headpiece dipping as she set the tray down with a hand that she forced to remain steady. "My apologies, Mr. Sokolov. The kitchen elevators were delayed." Victor watched her for a long, suffocating moment, his large rings catching the light as his fingers tapped a rhythmic, menacing beat on the marble. He looked for a flinch, a tremor, a sign of deceit. Finding only the hollow obedience of a girl who knew her place, he waved a dismissive hand. Petra retreated, her footsteps swallowed by the vastness of the room. She was a ghost in his house, a witness to his power who posed no threat, or so he believed. As she stepped back into the hallway, she caught the sharp military silhouette of Lennox Brooks approaching from the west wing, the man who kept the keys to the castle and the only man Victor truly trusted. Petra stepped into the shadows of a velvet curtain to let him pass, unaware that the ghost was about to hear a secret that would burn the fortress down. The velvet curtain was heavy, smelling of dust and old power, providing a narrow sanctuary for Petra to vanish as Lennox Brooks' heavy tread echoed down the west wing corridor. She intended to wait until he passed, a momentary pause in her routine, but the sound of a second pair of footsteps, sharper, more rhythmic, made her breath hitch. Lennox stopped just inches from her hiding spot. Through the sliver of space between the fabric and the gold-leafed wainscoting, Petra saw him. He wasn't alone. Standing opposite him was a man whose presence felt like a jagged blade in the refined air of the estate, Ruslan Nemov. Victorian's rival looked out of place in his tactical leather jacket, his face scarred by a history of violence that even the Sokolov wealth couldn't polish away. "You're late, Ruslan," Lennox hissed, his voice stripped of the professional warmth he usually reserved for the staff. "The cameras in this sector are on a 90-second loop, but even ghosts leave shadows." Ruslan didn't look intimidated. He leaned against the wall, his smirk a jagged line of teeth. "I don't care about shadows, Lennox. I care about the gate. My men are ready to move when the snow starts falling at the gala. Do you have it?" Lennox reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit jacket. He pulled out a slim, silver thumb drive, the metal catching the dim light of the hallway chandeliers. "The primary gate codes, the secondary biometric bypass, and the dead zone map for the perimeter guards. At 10 p.m., the north entrance will be a black hole. No alarms, no logs, no survivors." Petra felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands, still gripping the empty silver tray, began to tremble. This wasn't just a business disagreement. It was a blueprint for a massacre. The man who had been herded into the Sokolov Minim Circle as its fiercest protector was handing over the keys to the kingdom. "And Victorian?" Ruslan asked, his voice a low, hungry growl. "He'll be in the ballroom, showing off his ink and his ego," Lennox replied coldly. "By the time he realizes the shield is down, I'll be halfway to the airport, and you'll be the new king of the East Side." Lennox handed the drive over. As Ruslan's fingers closed around it, a sudden, sharp clink echoed through the hallway. Petra had accidentally tapped her tray against a decorative marble bust. The silence that followed was absolute. Petra froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw Lennox's head turn, his eyes narrowing as he stared directly toward the curtain. His hand shifted to the holster at his hip, the leather creaking in the silence. "Did you hear that?" Lennox whispered, his voice now a lethal, focused thread. Petra's lungs burned as she held her breath. Her body pressed so thin against the stone wall, she felt the chill of the masonry through her uniform. On the other side of the velvet, the air had turned electric. She heard the soft, rhythmic slide of Lennox's footsteps, measured, predatory, as he approached the curtain. The silver tray in her hands felt like a lightning rod, ready to betray her with a single vibration. "Go," Lennox muttered to Ruslan, his voice a low vibration. "Check the service stairs. I'll handle this." The sound of Ruslan's retreating steps was followed by a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. Then, a hand gripped the edge of the curtain. Lennox them yank it open. He peeled it back slowly with the agonizing deliberation of a man who already knew what he would find. When the fabric moved, Petra was gone. She had slipped through the narrow servants' panel, a seam in the wood she'd spent weeks dusting, and was now crouching in the dark, lightless gut of the house. Lennox stared at the empty space. His eyes flicked to the floor, where a single, tiny bead of condensation from the water glass Petra had carried remained on the marble. He knelt, touching the cold droplet with a gloved finger. His gaze shifted to the wall, his eyes narrowing as he traced the invisible lines of the concealed door. "I know you're in the walls, little bird," Lennox whispered, the sound carrying through the ventilation slats with terrifying clarity. He didn't sound angry, he sounded clinical. "And I know which uniform you wear. There are only 4 of you assigned to the West Wing this morning." Petra scrambled backward in the dark, her hands scraping against rough-hewn timber and copper pipes. She emerged 2 floors down in the laundry room, her face flushed and her heart thundering. She tried to smooth her apron to look like the invisible help once more, but as she looked up, she saw a security monitor mounted on the wall. The red tally light was on. Lennox was standing in the center of the hallway she had just vacated, looking directly into the camera lens. He raised his hand, pointing a finger toward the screen in a silent, lethal promise. He wasn't going to raise the alarm. That would ruin his deal with Ruslan. He was going to hunt her himself, using the very security system designed to protect the house, to trap the girl who knew his secret. Petra realized then that her invisibility had vanished. She was no longer a ghost in the Sokolov mansion. She was the prey. Every camera she passed, every sensor she triggered, was now a breadcrumb leading the trigger straight to her. To survive, she couldn't just hide. She had to find a way to strike back before the dead zone became her grave. The library of the Sokolov estate was a cathedral of letter-bound silence, a room where the history of the Bratva was archived in gold-leafed spines and encrypted hard drives. Petra entered with a feather duster in hand, her movements mechanical, though her skin crawled with the sensation of Lennox's gaze through the ceiling-mounted domes. She knew the routine. The guards never questioned a maid cleaning the boss's sanctum, but she only had the window of time it took for the floor polish to dry. She moved toward the ornate mahogany desk that housed the secondary security terminal. Victorin used it for guest logs, but Petra had seen Lennox use it late at night to balance the shadow books. She knelt, ostensibly to scrub the baseboards, but her fingers reached for the underside of the desk where a backup bypass port was hidden. a secret she'd discovered while cleaning a spilled inkwell months prior. She pulled a small, battered smartphone from her apron, the only thing she owned that hadn't been issued by the estate. Using a tethering cable, she tapped into the local area network. Her screen flared to life, scrolling through lines of Cyrillic code and encrypted file paths. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she navigated toward the logistics folder. She wasn't looking for gate codes, she was looking for the why. There, buried under a subdirectory labeled Winter Maintenance, she found it. A series of wire transfers. The sums were staggering, routed through a shell company in Cyprus and ending in a private account under the name L. Brooks. The dates lined up perfectly with the arrival of Ruslan Nemov's shipments at the docks. "Got you," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. The data was a digital confession, a paper trail that turned Lennox from a trusted shield into a paid assassin. She began the download, the progress bar creeping forward with agonizing slowness. A floorboard creaked outside the heavy oak doors. Petra's blood turned to ice. She didn't look up, but she could feel the shift in the air, the presence of someone who didn't belong to the cleaning staff. The download hit 90%, 95. She yanked the cable just as the door handle turned. She stuffed the phone into her bodice, the plastic cold against her skin, and began scrubbing the mahogany with a frantic, desperate energy. When the door swung open, it wasn't a guard. It was the silence itself that felt threatening. She looked up, her face a mask of wide-eye, innocent alarm, praying that the heat in her cheeks looked like exertion rather than the burning terror of a girl who had just stolen a dead man's secret. The oak door didn't just open, it hit the stopper with a heavy, final thud that vibrated through the floorboards. Viktorin Sokolov stood in the threshold, his silhouette casting a long, jagged shadow that reached across the mahogany desk to the very spot where Petra knelt. The room, usually a sanctuary of cold logic, was suddenly suffocating. Viktorin's eyes, gray as a Siberian winter, locked onto her with a precision that felt like a crosshair. He didn't yell. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble that seemed to come from the stone itself. "The library was polished an hour ago, Petra." He stepped into the room, his black leather shoes clicking with a rhythmic, military cadence. His gaze dropped to the port beneath the desk, then to the slight, unnatural bulge of the phone hidden against her chest. He reached out, his hand tattooed with the thorns of a man who had survived 1,000 betrayals, gripping the edge of the desk. The sheer mass of his presence made the air feel thin. "I do not like ghosts in my sanctum," he whispered, leaning down until she could smell the faint scent of cedarwood and cold metal. "And I especially do not like ghosts who steal. Give me the device." Petra's heart hammered so violently she feared he could see it through her uniform. Her mind raced. If she handed over the phone without context, she was a spy. If she stayed silent, she was a thief. She reached into her bodice, her fingers trembling as she pulled out the smartphone. The screen was still warm. "I wasn't stealing from you, Mr. Sokolov," she gasped, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "I was stealing for you." Viktorin's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine, dangerous confusion flickering across his face. He snatched the phone from her hand, his thumb swiping across the open file of wire transfers. He saw the name L. Brooks. He saw the shell company in Cyprus. He saw the astronomical figures that bought a man's loyalty. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any shout. Viktorin's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned white, his rings digging into the casing. He looked at the data, then back at Petra, his expression shifting from rage to a profound, icy shock. The man he had treated as a brother, the man who held the keys to his life, had been quantified in his spreadsheet. Brooks, Viktorin breathed, the name sounding like a curse. He reached down and grabbed Petra's arm, not with the intent to harm, but with the desperate grip of a man realizing his foundation has turned to sand. "How long have you known?" "Minutes," Petra whispered. "The gate codes. They're selling the gate codes for the gala." Viktorin's hand remained like a shackle around Petra's arm, his thumb pressing into the thin fabric of her sleeve. He didn't pull her up. He forced her to stay on her knees, bringing his face level with hers. The cold light of the library cast his features into sharp, demonic relief. For a man whose life was built on anticipating the strike of an enemy, the revelation that the blade was already at his throat was a specialized kind of agony. "You are a maid, Petra," he hissed, the words dripping with a deadly skepticism. "You scrub floors, you empty ashtrays, And yet you expect me to believe you found what my internal auditors missed? That Lennox, a man who has bled for this family, is a common rat? He isn't a rat, sir, Petra whispered, her voice shaking but her gaze refusing to drop. He's a ghost. He knows exactly where your eyes aren't looking, because he's the one who tells you where to look. Victorin's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. He looked back at the phone, scrolling through the Cyprus transfers again. He was looking for a flaw, a reason to call her a liar and snap her neck. But the numbers were cold, and the logic was surgical. He recognized the account routing styles. It was the same method the Bratva used to move black money. Lennox hadn't just betrayed him. He had used Victorin's own playbook to do it. The boss let go of her arm. He stood up, pacing the length of the marble desk like a caged wolf. The realization was beginning to sink in, turning his initial rage into a calculated, freezing clarity. He looked at the security camera in the corner of the room, the very lens Lennox monitored from the command center. "He's watching us now, isn't he?" Victorin asked, his voice suddenly calm, which was infinitely more terrifying. "The library feed is on a staggered delay for your privacy," Petra said, her hypervigilance finally serving a purpose. "He won't see this for another 3 minutes, but he knows I was here. He knows I saw him in the hallway with Mimov." Victorin stopped. He looked at his hands, the tattoos, the rings, the power they represented. It was all a hollow shell if his primary gate was already open. He turned back to Petra. His expression shifted into something she hadn't seen before, a grim, mutual recognition. "He thinks he's the shield," Victorin murmured, more to himself than to her. He reached out, offering a hand to help her off the floor, a gesture of respect that felt like a coronation. But he forgot that the smallest cracks are what bring down the fortress. If he wants to sell my gate, we will let him, but we will choose who is waiting on the other side. The air inside the Sokolov ballroom was a thick slurry of expensive perfume, Cuban tobacco, and the underlying scent of a storm brewing. Crystal chandeliers vibrated with the low, rhythmic thrum of a string quartet, but the elegance was a shroud. Victorin stood in the center of the floor, the devil of Moscow, in a tuxedo that hid his ink, but couldn't mask the lethal stillness of his frame. He played the part of the gracious Elst, but his eyes never stayed on one guest for more than a second. 40 feet below the festivities, tucked into a cramped maintenance closet that smelled of copper pipes and damp concrete, Petra Vaughn sat before a portable monitor she had spliced into the estate's fiber optic spine. Her fingers were cold, dancing over a keyboard to bypass the loops Lennox had programmed into the main system. On her screen, the dead zone, the north entrance, appeared as a grainy, monochromatic shadow. At exactly 10 p.m., the digital clock in the corner of her screen flickered. The primary gate sensor didn't flash red, it simply went dark. Lennox's ghost code had executed perfectly, turning the most fortified entrance in the city into a wide-open wound. Petra leaned closer to the screen. Through the swirling snow of the outdoor feed, 3 black SUVs drifted toward the perimeter like sharks in a lightless sea. They didn't have their headlights on. They didn't need them. They were following the infrared beacons Lennox had planted in the garden. "They're here," Petra whispered into her headset, her voice cracking under the weight of the moment. Northgate preached. 12 men, full tactical gear. They aren't carrying traditional Brava blades, Victorin. They have silenced submachine guns. On the monitor, she watched a man in a familiar charcoal suit, Lennox, step out from the shadows of the stone archway. He didn't raise his weapon. He raised his hand in a casual greeting to the lead intruder. Ruslan Nenov stepped out of the first vehicle, his face illuminated by the amber glow of a single security light. The 2 men stood together in the dead zone, a portrait of absolute betrayal. "They're moving toward the service entrance," Petra warned, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Lennox is leading them through the kitchen corridor. He thinks he's bypassing the guards, but he's walking straight into the bottleneck." "Copy," Victorian's voice came back, a low, terrifying vibration in her ear. "Keep the loop running, Petra. Let them believe they are invisible. We are waiting in the dark." The first muffled thud of a suppressed round echoed not through the air, but through the structure of the house itself. In the ballroom, the string quartet continued their frantic Vivaldi, oblivious to the fact that the kitchen staff had already been neutralized. Victorin didn't wait for the doors to burst open. He caught Petra's eye through a hidden camera lens and moved toward the heavy velvet tapestries behind the bar with the grace of a panther. Petra's hands flew across the keyboard, triggering the electromagnetic locks on the service panels. "Third panel from the left, Victorin. Push. Now." The wall groaned, a narrow sliver of shadow opening to swallow the boss just as Ruslan's hitmen rounded the corner into the grand hall. Inside the tunnel, the air was stale, tasting of copper and lime. Petra appeared at the far end of the passage, a small flashlight in one hand and her smartphone in the other. She wasn't the trembling maid anymore. She was the navigator of a labyrinth Lennox had forgotten to map. "Lennox is bringing them up through the grand staircase," Petra whispered, her voice a ghost in the narrow stone throat of the passage. "He thinks he has you cornered in the ballroom. He doesn't know about the dusting routes, the passages we used to clear the chandeliers." Victorian followed her, his large frame nearly filling the tight space. He held a silenced Makarov with a grip that turned his knuckles into white stones. Above them, the heavy thump-thump of tactical boots on marble vibrated through the ceiling. The hunters were in the ballroom, finding it empty. "He's confused," Petra murmured, staring at the thermal feed on her phone. "Lennox is stopping. He's looking at the security feed, but I've got him on a 30-second loop of an empty room." They reached a heavy iron grating that looked down into the ballroom from 20 feet up, hidden behind a decorative frieze. Below, Lennox stood in the center of the room, his face twisted in a mask of sudden, sharp panic. He spun in circles, his gun raised, staring at the empty velvet chairs and the abandoned champagne flutes. Ruslan stood beside him, his rage radiating off the screen in hot pulses of infrared light. "He sold the gate," Victorian whispered, his voice a cold promise of death as he leveled his weapon through the decorative scrollwork. "But he forgot who built the house." Petra reached out, her finger hovering over the emergency vent trigger. "On your mark, boss. I'll kill the lights and lock the main doors. They'll be trapped in the dark with a ghost." Victorian didn't look at the men below. He looked at the maid beside him, the girl who had turned his gilded cage into a weapon. "Now, Petra, drop the veil." The silence that followed the final gunshot was more deafening than the chaos that preceded it. The ballroom, once a temple of gilded excess, was now a tomb of shattered crystal and cooling brass. Victorian stepped out from the shadows of the service passage, his tuxedo jacket discarded, the dark ink of the thorns on his arms visible in the dim emergency lighting. He didn't look at the bodies of Ruslan Nemov or the men who had followed him. His eyes were fixed on the crumpled form of Lennox Brooks, who lay near the north gate he had tried to sell. Petra emerged slowly behind the boss. She still wore the black maid's dress, but the white headpiece was gone, and her hands no longer trembled. She looked at the ruin of the estate, the broken marble, the spilled wine, and realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the mess. Victorian turned to her. The cold Arctic ice in his gaze had thawed into something resembling a grim, profound respect. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver thumb drive she had helped him reclaim. He didn't toss it into the fire, he held it out to her, a small piece of metal that represented the total collapse of his security, and the girl who had rebuilt it in a single night. "The agency said you were a ghost, Petra," Victorian said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried no threat. "They were wrong. Ghosts only watch. You acted." He walked to the mahogany desk, now scarred by a stray bullet, and pulled out a heavy black chair, the one usually reserved for his most trusted advisor. He didn't sit. He gestured for her to take the place Lennox had vacated. "I have enough people to scrub my floors," he continued, leaning over the desk until his tattooed hands were braced against the marble. "I have enough soldiers to pull triggers. What I lack is a shield, someone who sees the cracks before the fortress falls." Petra looked at the chair, then up at the man who ruled the city's shadows. The invisible maid was dead, buried under the weight of the night's violence. In her place stood a woman who had audited a dawn and lived to tell the tale. "I don't want to go back to the agency," Petra said, her voice finally finding its edge. "You won't," Victorian promised. He reached out, his large ring catching the dim light as he placed a hand on the desk near hers. "From this morning, you are the head of intelligence. You won't be hiding in the walls anymore, Petra. You'll be the one deciding who is allowed inside them." As the sun began to rise over the snowy grounds of the estate, Petra sat. She reached for the terminal, her fingers already beginning to map the new security protocols for a house that was no longer a gilded cage, but her command center. The audit was over, the traitors were gone, and the new era of the Sokolov Bretva had just begun, signed in blood and secured by the girl who had seen it all coming.